right, we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending on what time it is where you're watching this. My name is Christopher Fletcher. I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for Renaissance Studies here at the Newberry, and it is my great pleasure to be the moderator for the next session of short presentations entitled Spiritual Eating, Food and Early Modern Conversion Narratives. We have three wonderful presentations that will delve into the connection between food and another very important cultural force in the early modern period, namely religion. So as with the previous panel, each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will open it up for the Q&A. So please continue to put any questions you have in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to that when the time comes. For now, though, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker, which is Michael Walkden, who will speak to us about the fruits of sin, inwardness, and indigestion in Calvinist conversion narratives. Take it away, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Can everyone see my screen okay? All good? Okay.
Yes, we're good.
Yep. Great, okay. So, in 1608, a young woman named Dionysus Fitzherbert fell into a state of spiritual despair after eating a baked apple. Fitzherbert was about 26 years old and had recently become lady-in-waiting to the Countess of Huntingdon. Her troubles began when she faked an episode of indigestion or wind colic to escape an unwanted social commitment. That same night, one of her servants brought her a baked apple, which, Fitzherbert wrote, I did eat, never thinking how ill it was for the disease I pretended to be troubled withal. After eating the fruit, Fitzherbert felt as if the core of the apple had become stuck in her throat, and that it could never be gotten from thence, but that it would kill me. She then began to vomit until it seemed as if all the yard should flow with the matter that came out of her mouth. Physicians were called, and Fitzherbert was locked away in a dark room and plied with purging medicines. The worst of her symptoms did eventually lift, but this incident seems to have left a powerful impression on her. She later described it as a most fearful case and a warning to everyone to take heed that though they stand, they fall not. It should be clear from this example that bodily experience could play a crucially important role in religious experience, but accounts like this also pose multiple problems for historians. We have no way of knowing whether or not these events really happened as described, and even if they did, it can be very difficult to say what they mean. In a recent and excellent study of conversion narratives, Abigail Shin has shown how the descriptions of bodily experience in these texts provide evidentiary proof for an otherwise intangible and invisible change in religious identity. But Shin also claims that the experience of conversion cannot be recovered through texts, which is quite a common refrain in people who approach these as discursive structures as opposed to experiential ones. And in this paper, I'd like to push back on this by suggesting that the recurrence of fruit-induced illness in conversion narratives does provide historians with access to a form of emotional experience. And in this short paper, I'm going to very briefly consider 4 interlocking narratives that gave shape to these sorts of experiences. So humoral medicine provided one of the main foundations for beliefs about fruit's hurtful effects on the body. Within the humoral framework, the cold and moist properties of fruit made it especially unsuited to English bodies, whose exposure to rain and wind made them particularly susceptible to phlegmatic diseases. Apples were among the worst offenders, with medical writers describing them as hurtful to the stomach, causing windiness and blastings in the belly, engendering great store of wind and often bringing the colic. This wind colic was an illness that was thought to disproportionately affect women, who were believed to be more phlegmatic than men and also more inclined towards intemperate fruit consumption. And we can see this in the writings, in addition to Dionysus Fitzherbert, we can see this in the writings of the noblewoman Elizabeth Isham, who sometime around 1620 began breaking into her father's family's cupboards and consuming large quantities of pears. The consequences of Isham's bad diet ultimately caught up with her. In 1622, at the age of 14, she was afflicted with a great fit of the wind colic, which she attributed to abundance of ill humors, ill juice, and ill moisture. So fruit stealing of the kind described by Elizabeth Isham was a recurrent motif in spiritual writings from the period, practically all of which were influenced by the Confessions of St. Augustine. This was one of the most popular and widely read devotional works in 17th century England. And one episode from the Confessions, which I've shown an extract from here, which enjoyed especially wide circulation, saw Augustine breaking into a neighboring orchard and carrying away huge quantities of stolen pears. We can also see this in the influence of this episode in the autobiography of the Puritan minister Richard Baxter. In his youth, Baxter claimed that he'd been much addicted to the excessive gluttonous eating of apples and pears, even robbing orchards near his family home in Shropshire. Unlike Augustine's pear episode, however, Baxter's spiritual trials were expressed in a distinctly embodied register, channeling his guilty conscience through the explanatory model of humoral medicine. He claimed that his long road to discovery depended first and foremost on temperance as to quantity and quality of food. And this idea of dietary temperance, the middle way between extremes of gluttony and abstinence, is crucial to understanding how morality and medicine intersected in this period and in these narratives. In the 16th century, the Venetian nobleman Alvise Cornaro published a short work titled De Vita Sobria, translated into English by George Herbert as A Treatise of Temperance and Sobriety. And this is a copy from the Folger Shakespeare Library with some wonderful reader's marks, which says an eminent good example of temperance. Read it often. Whether or not the person did, we don't know, but certainly that was the ideal. So this work lays out some key principles for living a temperate life. And it's notable for both its astonishing popularity across Europe in various translations, and also for its extensive discussion of diet. In the religious setting of Protestant England, Cornaro's explicit fusion of humoral dietetics with the ethics of temperance offered a tangible experiential means of rooting out indwelling sin. Far from being an abstract philosophical ideal, temperance has shaped thought and behavior at the material level, conditioning the ethical terms of engagement between the godly and their environment. Within this medicalized moral framework, illness induced by intemperate consumption, and especially of fruit, could take on a profoundly spiritual dimension. For instance, after the 16-year-old Elizabeth Livingston became ill from eating a large quantity of fruit, she later reflected that sickness seizes her as a due reward of intemperance. But if there was one story about fruit that was known to practically every man, woman, and child in early modern Europe, it was the story of Adam and Eve and the fall of man. And because of Eve's pivotal role in the moment of original sin, women were frequently attacked both in print and from the pulpit for their literal and figurative alleged appetites. Old Eve is too much in us all, warned one minister, but especially in women who long most to taste forbidden fruit. Godly women would have been confronted with these sorts of endless reminders of their complicity in the fall. It's impossible to understand the psychological importance of an apple to someone like Dionysius Fitzherbert without acknowledging the existence of this particular form of misogyny and the ways in which it might have become internalized in some people. So the evidence that we do have suggests, and there's a lot of this, but I couldn't present all of it in this short talk, does suggest that the narrative of the fall gave shape and structure to the ways in which godly women narrated and even maybe experienced the events of their lives. If we return to Elizabeth Isham's writings, we see that both temptation and parental authority played a crucial role. At one point, she writes that my father enjoining me that I should eat no pears, but they tempting me every time I saw them, I should take one, having some regard to my father's command. And in Elizabeth Livingston's account, likewise, fruit-induced illness has distinct biblical overtones. She says, let me never forget how miserably I have fallen, and they're capitalized, and therefore never cease diligently to watch over all my ways. So, but just to conclude, by setting humoral medicine alongside the ethic of temperance, the fruit stealing episode from Augustine's Confessions, and the narrative of the fall, we begin to see more clearly how a godly woman's embodied experiences could have been shaped by narratives that she would have absorbed through listening and reading from a very early age. All of these narratives are ones that are very, very widely dispersed and very frequently repeated in this period. A persuasive claim in recent scholarship is that narratives are themselves embodied, that psychosomatic experience is shaped fundamentally by the stories which structure shared systems of meaning in a given culture. If we accept this claim, it becomes impossible to separate bodily experience from the stories we tell about ourselves. And what I've aimed to show in this short paper is that this embodied framework offers one way of bridging the perceived gap between narrative and experience, revealing how shared narratives could shape not just how godly individuals narrated their emotions, but also what it felt like to experience those emotions. And the fact that these events may not have occurred exactly as described, or in some cases may not have occurred at all, doesn't make them any less valuable as sources for understanding the subjective experiences of historical actors. To borrow the words of the historian Michael MacDonald, stories are really all we have to reconstruct the inner lives of people in the past, because stories are what they were made from in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for getting us off to such a good start. Let's continue moving to hear about Calvinists from another perspective. I'm going to hand it over to Eleanor Barnett, who will take us to Venice and talk to us about food and conversion narratives in the Venetian Inquisition. Take it away, Eleanor.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for organizing such an amazing conference and for inviting me to be a part of this fascinating panel. So I'm just going to move my text box. Okay. So in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on food and conversion narratives within the records of the Venetian Inquisition. So Venice is an especially rich case study, I think, to look at this theme. As such a significant trading post between the East and the West, the city acted as a point of contact between Catholics, Protestants, Greek Orthodox Christians, Jews, Muslims, and others. And in particular, I'm just showing here the large German Lutheran community on the right, right by the Rialto Bridge. And of course, the large international Jewish community who were housed in the ghetto, which is shown here on the left. But despite this kind of relative toleration to other faiths, Venice wholeheartedly took up the Counter-Reformation's task to guarantee the supremacy of the Catholic Church and established the Venetian Inquisition on the 22nd of April, 1547. And in the time here, I'd like to just present two stories from the Inquisition archives, one concerning Protestantism and one looking at Judaism. And I want to argue that by focusing on food in these narratives, we can get closer to understanding what religious identities meant to ordinary people and how religious conversion was experienced in the early modern period. So first, the story of Mark Antonio Varetta, a local Venetian who presented a confession of Calvinism to the Holy Office in 1567. In his account, Mark Antonio described how after having become curious and eager to learn more about Calvinism, he left Venice and eventually arrived in Geneva. When he arrived, he was greeted in the city by many Italians who had taken up the Protestant faith, and he was quick to distinguish them through their diet. So in Catholic Italy, meat eating was banned on Fridays, Saturdays, and during Lent. But in Geneva, Mark Antonio noted that that day was Saturday, and in the morning the minister had given some meat to eat. Some meat to eat. After a while, Mark Antonio then converted to Calvinism, convinced by arguments relating to Catholic idolatry and the importance of individual Bible study as a means of escaping the supposed misinterpretations of the Pope. He then returned to Italy and lived in house to house among a covert network of Italian Protestants. And at this point in the narrative, he then presents fast breaking as an important part of his own religious identity by eating meats on Fridays, for instance, and breaking Lent with meat and eggs. By breaking Catholic fasting laws, Mark Antonio sided himself with the Protestant movements, the leaders of which, including Erasmus, Luther, and Calvin, had broken down the necessity to fast from meat and animal products. And I just included here one example briefly from Luther, who emphasized that St. Paul had granted Christians liberty in food choices, and argued that the Catholic Church went against this teaching in order to make money from the laity by selling them these licenses to eat prohibited foods on fast days. And he famously mocked Catholic authorities for implying that eating butter was a greater sin than lying, blaspheming, or, as it says here, indulging in impurity. Fast breaking became an almost universal feature of Protestant heresy and Inquisition trials. So here's another example of an Englishman, Robert Risdon, another confession of Calvinism, who said that he ate meat every day, like the English. So when theological details were sparse, diet acted as a sensorial language that all could recognize as indicative of one's religious identity. And since we're thinking about the book at this conference, I'd like to suggest that Mark Antonio's account should be read alongside other printed conversion narratives, like those, for example, found in travellers' accounts. So English Protestant writers, for instance, warned of the dangers of travel to Catholic lands, especially Italy and especially Rome, for those who had started with this similar sense of curiosity to see what it was like for those of other religions. Once in Italy, bodily temptations, so the sights, smells, and indeed, of course, the tastes of Catholic practice, were understood as kind of visceral threats to one's religious identity. Writers described conversion as an infection that could overcome the soul via the kind of porous early modern body. And as Rebecca Earle and others have shown, since bodies were thought to be kind of adjusted to the different diet and climate of their native country, early modern travel was seen as a dangerous act that could threaten the physicality and also the kind of fundamental character of a person. So Mark Antonio perhaps followed established literary conventions and contemporary understandings of what conversion was by describing his conversion as a process that involved theological and dietary change spurred on by this travel to foreign lands. He ended his account by recording a benediction that he had heard said at mealtimes by Calvinists, a variant of the form of worship that had been written by Calvin himself. His decision to include the blessing shows that the Holy Office was interested in understanding these embodied and everyday aspects of religious expression that happened around the table. Okay, so in my second example, I'd like to turn to the case against the Portuguese merchant Gaspar Ribeira and his son Giovanni. This was the biggest case in the 16th century connected to Judaism, and it was also connected to the Portuguese Inquisition, where the family were questioned before they arrived in Venice. I should note that being Jewish in itself was not a crime in Venice. You could live openly as such in the ghetto, but the Inquisition was concerned with policing so-called new Christians who had converted to Catholicism from Judaism, often forcibly in the Iberian Peninsula, and who they believed were at risk of lapsing back into the Jewish faith. So the Ribeira family came to the attention of the Venetian Inquisition when Giovanni secretly married a Jewish woman named Alhambra. Then the Inquisition started to seek evidence against the whole family and became concerned with their dietary practices. So for example, here, this is the bookkeeper from their household who was brought in as a witness, and he reported, "While I was in their house, they sometimes did not eat in the morning, but dined at the end of the evening. And I later understood that this was a custom of the Jews, that they fast and don't eat if it isn't the evening." And a young boy that was in their house said that they had gone to dine outside of the house. And knowing that they didn't go outside to eat, I became suspicious and I asked a Jew if it was a fast day for them. And he said yes. So just as Mark Antonio presented fast breaking as a sign of his conversion to Protestantism, witnesses interpreted the Ribeira's food practices as evidence of their conversion or reconversion to Judaism. However, this case is complicated by the fact that the Ribeiras denied the accusation. When questioned by the inquisitors back in Portugal, Gaspar's first wife, Isabel, claimed that she was actually a good Christian, and she related, albeit with some errors, the Pater Noster, the Ave Maria, and so on. At the same time, though, she admitted to fasting on Monday and Saturday during a period of personal difficulties, following a Jewish tradition that had been prescribed to her by a kind of new Christian elder or elderly woman. She also admitted to throwing a pinch of dough into the fire when baking bread, according to the Jewish challah making ritual. Her testimony may suggest that despite a genuine intent to convert to Catholicism, old customs were hard to expel entirely. And as Chris Kissain has observed in regards to new Christians living in 15th century Castile, even if a conversion to Christianity was sincere, traditional or kind of cultural kitchen habits were hard to break, or even to separate from the definitively religious. So in conclusion, this discussion has shown that food, and especially fasting practices and eating rituals of religious significance acted as a visible and kind of sensory way of identifying the religious other in early modern Europe. Changes in what and how people ate were therefore seen as an essential part of religious conversion. And I think this was about fitting in to the kind of food customs and laws of that faith. But I also want to suggest that at a time when, as Michael was sort of suggesting as well, that the body and soul were more kind of fluidly connected in European medicinal discourse, eating like someone of a different faith could actually play a part in physically and spiritually becoming someone of that faith. And finally, different food practices might have attracted some people to convert. So accounts sometimes talk about Protestants being converted by the delights of Catholicism, kind of the food delights of Catholicism, and then at the same time Catholics talk about converting, or the fear of converting, because of the lure of fast breaking. But equally, because foodways are and were so integral to people's experiences of culture, community, and identity from a young age, they were perhaps the hardest thing to give up for any sustained time. And they therefore offered a way, especially for those who were forcibly converted, to remain connected to their native faith. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. That was wonderful. We'll keep moving on now to a subject that is so rich it takes two people to talk about it. So we're happy to have Elisa Tersini and Danielle Sottosante to tell us about from aqua imperialis to spice, Muslim and Jewish influences in early modern English recipe. So Elisa, take it away.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm going to read the first half, and then I'm going to turn it over to Danielle. So hopefully our technology cooperates with us. Okay, so in a 17th century manuscript receipt book, a recipe for a ward against poisoning and pestilence identifies the special water as aqua imperialis, explaining that the name comes from the emperors and the great lords of the Saracen having drank it. At first glance, this recipe, contained in the Folger Shakespeare Library's manuscript VA 562, seems to be a straightforward example of the English appropriation of a Saracen, that is an Arab or Muslim recipe. However, the recipe's name and explanation raise more questions than they answer. In the short paper, we'll use the case of aqua imperialis to briefly explore how, in early modern England, ingredients and recipes might be religiously inflected, and whether a recipe that is inflected as religiously other can be converted or assimilated. In considering whether foodstuffs can be religiously inflected and converted, we hope to contribute to the scholarship on conversion narratives more broadly. Recipes for aquas or waters of various kinds are abundant in both manuscript and print books, but of these waters, aqua imperialis appears to have been relatively uncommon. The four aquas identified in the OED's entry for aqua, aqua fortis, aqua mirabilis, aqua regia, and aqua vitae, all appear regularly in both early modern recipe books and in dictionaries. Conversely, we found aqua imperialis, or imperial water, only a handful of times in the Folger's manuscript recipe collection and a handful of times in printed recipe books, and we've yet to find an entry for it in a contemporary dictionary. Furthermore, the definition for imperial water that the OED offers states that it was a medicinal drink made with cream of tartar, lemon, or occasionally orange rind, and sugar, which is nothing like the recipe with which we began, which combines tormentil, scabious, betony, and pimpernel. Not only do none of these ingredients overlap, but the experience of drinking them would have been very different. The combination of cream of tartar, lemon, and sugar may have been used medicinally, but it is reasonably pleasant to consume, weak, tart, and foamy. Scabious, betony, and pimpernel are purgatives, causing one to sweat, vomit, and swell. Perhaps effective in avoiding poisoning, as the recipe claims, but not something one would want to consume regularly. How did this special water, aqua imperialis, start as an Arab and Islamic inflected purgative and end up as an English sugar drink? We haven't found all the answers yet, but we'll walk you through some of the interesting connections that we've made. A second manuscript in the Folger Shakespeare Library's collection, manuscript EA5, contains two recipes, to make imperial water and to make another imperial water. The latter of these recipes is nearly identical to the aqua imperialis recipe, both in terms of its ingredients and its claims, except that the recipe mentions only that it is recommended by the philosopher and not that it is used by the lords of the Saracen. The first of the recipes is notable in that it is nothing like the other two sharing its name. Not only does it include everything but the kitchen sink, but also the spices and herbs are steeped in wine, not water, which would be counter to some Islamic tradition. A third manuscript in the library's collection, WA332, offers yet another version, a hybrid of the original Betony and the all but the kitchen sink versions. What is notable here is that even when it is not specifying a Saracen origin, and even though it is specifying that the herbs and spices should be steeped in wine and not water, it is recommending it to be used with a bezoar stone. Bezoar stone, or lapis bezoar orientale, was a stone obtained from Persian goats and was thought to act as the counterpoison. While this recipe does not reference its use by the lords of the Saracen, nor does it offer itself as an antidote to poison, the suggestion that it might work with bezoar stone suggests a connection to the original recipe and to Arab and Islamic medical traditions more broadly. The final example of imperial water that we found in the Folger Shakespeare Library's manuscript collection is the version of the recipe that is consistent across 18th and 19th century print recipe books, and the version that is recorded by the OED. Except for the name, the recipe bears no resemblance to its earlier counterpoint in method. In his blog post on adapting historical recipes, Stephen Schmidt argues that the first step should be to, quote, look at multiple contemporaneous recipes for your dish or conceit to discover what your recipe is telling you or not telling you, because whatever is unstated, unclear, unknown, or possibly erroneous in your particular recipe will likely be elucidated in others. In this case, comparing recipes illuminates the possible religious inflections and Arab-Islamic connections. Because it is so difficult to date a manuscript recipe book, and because it's unclear what the sources of these recipes are, we cannot speculate on a specific chronology of these recipes or claim that an Arab-Islamic recipe has been converted to an English Christian recipe.
However, the comparisons do allow for some interesting observations. First, the so-called Arab-Islamic or original actually doesn't specify that the herbs and spices should be steeped in water, not wine. It merely states that they should be distilled. We read into the title of the recipe that those herbs should be distilled in water because of our assumptions about what aqua, or water, means and what an Arab-Islamic recipe would or would not contain. The OED entry on water offers some examples of when water might mean spirits. Conversely, when scouring Latin databases, we were not able to find an example of aqua meaning alcoholic spirits. It is only in English that aqua can mean alcoholic spirits when it is qualified with an additional term. The shedding of the explicit Saracen reference and the express inclusion of wine therefore suggests to us a tempered assimilation of a medical recipe with Islamic inflections. Whether this was actually an Islamic recipe is unclear, and in some ways besides the point. The association would have been enough to warrant its Englishing or Christianizing. It is telling that even in the final version of this recipe, when it no longer contained alcohol proper and expressly used water, it still contained alcohol's output. Cream of tartar is a byproduct of wine production, so a Saracen lord might not have consumed the imperial water that is prescribed in virtually all of the manuscripts and print books that we examine. If the recipes titled imperial water are indeed all related, then the recipe did, over time, successfully shed any overt references to otherness. However, some other religiously inflected recipes or ingredients, codified as other, never shed their religious connotations, even over hundreds of years. Take, for instance, the mushroom Auricula judae, which appears in herbals and recipes as a remedy for a sore throat. The Latin Auricula judae means Judas's ear, named because the fungus grows on an elder tree, from which, according to Christian gospel, Judas hung himself. While in other early modern European languages, the Latin is translated correctly as Judas's ear, in English, it is translated as Jew's ear. Leonard R.N. Ashley has noted this as a mistranslation, but if it was a mistranslation, we'd expect to find at least a few corrections, and in our searches of medieval and early modern English databases, we've only found the term Jew's ear, and not Judas's ear. This might have been of the corruption of the Latin in an early source. The phrase is varied only by a single I, but we've also not found an example of a corrupted Latin version of the phrase. Rather than dismiss this merely as a mistranslation or even a corruption, we want to suggest that there might have been a deliberate conversion of the phrase Judas's ear to Jew's ear. This generalizing of the mushroom is consistent with our co-panelist, Dr. Walton's research on the associations of mushrooms and anti-Semitism in England. As his research shows, while mushrooms are widely consumed across Europe, there is shooting in England, where they're often treated with disgust. One of the things that we've appreciated about this conference are the resonances across papers. Gitanjali Shahani's a talk on coffee, in which he discussed the paradox of mutual disgust and pleasure within the other, and Jennifer Park's talk on the literal consumption of the other in the form of money particularly resonated with us. The adoption of an Arab-Islamic purgative, for instance, is telling. The so-called Arab-Islamic recipe is accepted only as it is literally rejected. The religiously inflected ingredients and recipes we have located so far seem to be medicinal rather than culinary, at least at first. Any pleasure that might have been derived from the consumption of these foodstuffs is not initially written into the recipe. Conversion narratives, like those discussed by Dr. Barnett in the previous paper, demonstrate that religious converts carry the stigma of their former religious identities. If religiously inflected ingredients or recipes can be converted from Islam or Judaism to Christianity, do they continue to carry the stigma of their former associations? Our preliminary research suggests yes. In 2005, the British Mycological Society gave Jew's ear a new, less offensive name, jelly ear, a synonym that was present but less frequently used in early modern England. The journey towards full inclusion into English society, without stereotypes or monikers that mark their otherness, was similarly slow for Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity during the medieval and early modern periods. Some medieval government and church documents identify Jewish converts as conversus and quondam Judaeus, thus maintaining their identities as former non-Christians despite their religious conversion. This distinction that could be to honor their conversion, but more likely signify distrust of the converts that could grow easily into open antagonism, according to Jonathan M. Lucan. In the early modern period, too, conversion carried a stigma. As Lika Stelling writes, while the winning of souls could be construed in political terms and explained as a national victory, every conversion, regardless of its direction, simultaneously carried the subversive implication that religious group identity was also interchangeable. The foodstuffs people consumed also carried changeable identity markers that reflected and contributed to their anxieties about race and religion. Thank you for listening, and thank you especially to all of our generous colleagues with whom we consulted, many of whom are listening here today.
Wonderful. Thank you both for that wonderful presentation. So now I invite all of our presenters to turn their videos back on as we enter into the Q&A session. We have some questions that are coming in. I do encourage you, everyone watching and listening, to please do put any questions you have in the Q&A using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them. I want to actually invoke my moderator's privilege of asking a question first of all of you. These are you've all shown really wonderful ways in which religion and food interact with each other, and especially how we can use food as a way to think about religion differently. And since this is a conference about food in the book, I also noticed the very impressive range of genres that you are drawing your examples from. So many different kinds of texts have been used to convey this sort of food-religion connection. So I wanted to ask each of you if you'd be willing to say just a little bit about how you see sort of the materiality of the text that you're dealing with as affecting sort of what view of religion do we get. So religious experience, as we know, is a very capacious term that could be expressed in a number of different ways. So I'm curious to hear you guys talk a little bit more about how your particular text or kinds of text that you're using in your presentations, what kind of religious experience is that really bringing us into? I guess we can go in order. So Michael, we'll start with you, and then we can just sort of go down the line.
Yeah, that's a really good question, I think, and something that so the example I used to open my piece, that Dionysus Fitzherbert, there are several different versions of that exist, and I think it's a particularly interesting text, and I'd encourage people to go and look at it, because like it's not been studied as much as it deserves, but like there are at least 2 scribal copies of it that exist. And what's interesting about those is I believe, I may be getting this slightly wrong, but I believe that in one of them, the oldest version, one of them is in her hand. That there's 2 scribal copies, and there's the one in Dionysus Fitzherbert's hand. And the original contains way more of this bodily stuff, and the ones that have been tidied up by scribal. So I don't know much about that process, so I don't want to get too like too into trying to like make claims about that. But the ones that have been tidied up, a lot of the bodily stuff has been excised, and I find that really interesting. And that's something that obviously I couldn't get into in my paper, but most of the, in fact, I think all of the apart from Baxter's thing that I drew on in that paper, are manuscripts as opposed to printed sources. So, and they're all, I think, handwritten by the person who is the voice, the author's voice. So I think you get, in some ways, that gives you a slightly less edited access to their experience, their embodiment, but obviously that comes with a huge number of caveats. Sorry, that's kind of a rambling answer, but that was the most interesting thing that I think I can say to that.
No, that's wonderful, especially if you want to think about this as the bridge between narrative and experience. The sort of very intimate nature of the creation of that text, I think, is a really important part of that. Thanks, Michael. Eleanor.
Yeah, so looking at Inquisition records, I think, the main kind of, or clear advantage is that you are hearing the voices of people who, otherwise you wouldn't be in print. So you do kind of get more to the ordinary people, perhaps. And you can also more explicitly hear from women who were less likely to produce printed conversion narratives. But of course, they are not kind of neutral texts. So they're kind of physically put through the voice of the notary who would decide what was written down. But also, of course, the narratives are going to be changed because the people don't want to be, sent to prison or accused or arrested or anything like that. So they are filtering what they're saying. And I think the result is perhaps to downplay the emotional nature of a conversion that you might find in the Calvinist sources. You know, they're kind of, I was turned inward and having these amazing religious experiences, whereas I think the Inquisition sources, they would play that down. And maybe you get more of like the kind of, what's the word, like things that they just know are gonna get them off the hook, I think.
Great, yeah, thanks. Wonderful, wonderful stuff with those odd inquisitorial documents. Elisa, Danielle, what do you think?
Do you want me to start, or I'll start? So, I mean, I think one of the things that really intrigues me about recipes, and Elisa is definitely the recipe expert, so I want to leave most of the talking to her, but is that we can see, even in times where there's open antagonism between religious groups. Like for me, I'm a medievalist by trade, so my period of study is mostly earlier. We still see in recipes cultural contact. You know, even in going back to like the trocula, we see influences of Arabic medicine on medieval culture, medieval Christian culture. And what really intrigued me about these early modern recipes is that, you know, we have, you know, recipes like aqua imperialis that, you know, are appearing, and they're appearing for the most part without judgment. And so I really see like recipes like offering an opportunity where you have like cultural contact and cultural exchange that almost like transcends some of the judgment that otherwise appears.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, that one of the most exciting things for me about the recipe books is that it constantly subverts my expectations about what it will be, materially speaking. So, you know, there's this assumption that, or I brought to studying the recipe books, these assumptions that they were more personal engagements, or that print came out of manuscript. So there's sort of this one-way direction. Whereas now that I've spent more time with the recipe books, I see that, you know, there's a lot working in the opposite direction. So people copying from print books. And so that makes it certainly less personal. It's not necessarily about personal experience unless we think about that in terms of like the way that people collect information or share knowledge. So yeah, materially speaking, the recipe books are just so interesting and not what you would expect.
Yes, I do love that. Going to the sources is always a way to find that what you expected is not there. It's not what's actually going on. We'll go to some questions from the audience here. I have one for Michael from Kathleen Lynch. She wants to know, how do you see this medicalized moral framework operating as bridging across religious divides or as an element or even driver of division? She's asking, given the common reference points of Adam and Eve and Augustine's Confessions, then also the translation of the Italian Catholic Cornaro into English by George Herbert.
Can you say the question part of it again, please?
How do you see this medicalized moral framework operating as bridging across religious divides or as an element or even driver of religious division?
Okay. So I feel like that's quite a complicated question with quite a complicated answer, but I would say that one of the things that is interesting, which I couldn't get into in my paper at all, and because also it's actually more relevant to a slightly later period, at least of English history, is the way in which these ideas about temperance and Cornaro's work are taken up in the chemical and Paracelsian literature subsequent, which also has an extremely kind of confused religious affiliate, like, you know, nominally more Christian and less pagan than humoral theory, but in practice often treated as sort of the heretical option by the establishment. So I'm perfectly willing to say that I find that a very challenging question to answer. But I would say, I think that the temperate stuff seems to me, at least in literate sources, to be so universal that like I see it as more of a bridge and more of a unifying feature across the different medical kind of schema that you have in this period than I do as a driver of division. I certainly think that there are more, certainly in England, there are more factions and religious divisions than there are medical ones.
I think that could be an interesting question for us, for all of you guys to sort of ruminate on. That's sort of like the what we might call the agency of food in the sort of very, at times very troubled religious climate in early modern Europe. So the thought that comes to my mind is sort of when Ulrich Zwingli has his break with Catholicism, he sits around with a bunch of people in Zurich and they very dramatically eat sausage on a Friday in Lent. And it's this whole, like, the illicitness of what they're doing is this great sort of political statement about where they stand religiously. And I think Eleanor and Elisa and Danielle, you guys come from kind of opposite sides of that. So I just would want to throw that question to you: is in this, do we see sort of food with any sort of kind of religious agency in the same way that, say, singing the Psalms does or owning a particular book does? Or is it more just kind of like just a thing that occasionally is used to signify maybe some religious identity, but isn't really driving sort of the practice of religion in any real way? Eleanor, you talked about the Inquisition, so you might have some particular things to say about that. So I'll invite you to answer that first.
I unmuted?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So whether the food has a kind of agency, and I mean, it brings to mind, you mentioned that people meeting and having these illicit banquets. I mean, that's something that's mirrored in the Venetian records as well. So I think it's not just a show of, I'm eating like a Jewish person or like a Christian, but it's the act of eating is something that the Inquisition are very concerned about, because of course it expresses friendship and community with those of another group. So I think in that sense, it's extremely powerful. I would also say something that is interesting coming out of the Venetian records is how these lines between different groups are very blurred through food, because it has both that strong religious meaning, but also, as I kind of mentioned, it's this cultural thing and it's about friendship. So there are some kind of grey areas of when people are eating, for example, a Catholic eating as a Jewish person, but are they doing it because they have friends in the ghetto, for example, or to what extent do they kind of really understand and believe in the kind of values that come with that religious identity? And so there's loads of interesting cases in the Inquisition, which are kind of these mixes of people through food, and a kind of blurring of identities.
Thank you. Lisa, Danielle, you guys have any thoughts on that?
I'm going to leave Danielle to take this one.
Well, one of the things that really struck me, first I have to say, Eleanor, I loved your paper. It was, and Michael too, that there were just such wonderful papers. And as you both were talking, I just kept having so many, ideas like flash in my mind. And one of them was that, this idea of like forbidden food, and how really when a religion forbids a food, and the choice of eating a food that is like forbidden to your religion, especially after conversion, is like such a moment of asserting like your personal agency. And for us, like when we were looking at these recipes, anytime something that was forbidden appeared, for example, when we noticed that there were some recipes for aqua imperialis that discussed alcohol, immediately, red flags sort of to go up for us. So it's like, it's this question that if something is forbidden, and a group makes the agency to either eat that food that it's forbidden to their own religion, or even like eat consume a food that is, or a drink that is connected to another religion, each time you're doing that, you're asserting that agency.
Okay, great. We have another question here for Eleanor, but I think everyone might be able to have something to say about it too. So if there's time, I'd love to throw it open. But Eleanor, outside of instances of conversion, when eating practices would shift, how distinct or insular were eating practices, recipes, and food traditions across different religious communities in Venice? Even if, say, kosher, halal, and Catholic Protestant markets might have been segregated, maybe they were, maybe they weren't, were recipes and cooking preparations shared across religious divides? Or were there any sort of like evidence of mixing between food traditions in this very, very unique place?
Yeah, so it was a very unique place. And I think the evidence is that, it was these different groups were far more mixed than the Inquisition would like us to believe, and that perhaps we assume as well, given that there were kind of zones like, as I mentioned, the ghetto, and then the German Lutheran merchants, and later the Muslims have their own, segregated area as well. But I think actually they were much more intertwined than that. So there are cases of Jewish people buying their bread from Christian bakers, for example, and so the Christians come in and have to distribute the bread, even for religious holidays. There's also a case that I found which was talking, have to think if I got this the right way around. So it was Christian butchers who were in trouble, I think, for preparing meat during Lent, and then I think their response was, "Oh, it's actually the Jewish butchers who are using our butchers, and they're just leaving us the bits that they can't eat, like the defected lungs and things like that." So yes, I think in theory people were supposed to be not mixing, but in reality there are all these kind of little ways in which they did. Another one is Rosa Salzberg has written a lovely article which looks at inns in Venice, and kind of shows how, because there were all these travelers coming from from the east and elsewhere, that sometimes they would bring their own food so that they could, which would then be prepared by the host or hostess of the inn, so that they could abide by their particular religious laws. But then people were mixing in those types of spaces as well. And food was one of those things that I'm sure was mixed around.
Great, wonderful. We have some more questions coming in. Here's one from Deborah Crone that is just kind of thrown open to everybody. She wonders if any of you have come across recipes that were specifically geared toward Jews or Muslims. And she's not aware of any recipe books like this that are addressed to these groups until much later in the 18th or 19th century. But it's a fascinating question, knowing how in places like Venice, and certainly relations with the Ottoman Empire are increasing throughout this time, if there's any evidence that you guys have seen for any of that.
I haven't seen any in England, but it's certainly something I'll look out for now that she's mentioned it. So thanks for the question.
Anyone else?
Not that I can think of right now. There's references, of course, to certain foods being associated with Jews and Muslims, but or as you were sort of saying, different names, so that have that implication that they're from Jewish and Islamic culture, but I can't think of recipes off the top of my head. But thank you, yeah, interesting question.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions, and we'll go with one for Michael that's pretty interesting, from Ashlyn Kuntz. Do we know why people were getting sick from eating fruits? If not because of the humoral explanations that they used at the time, do we have any sense of why it was that these colics happened? Or is there any evidence that the fruit was not actually to blame for any illnesses? So, way to stand up for the pears here.
I mean, hard to say, but I mean, fruit is extremely high in fiber. So if people are consuming large quantities of fruit, often in these cases kind of candied or baked with a lot of sugar. When they say when Fitzherbert says a baked apple, she probably means baked with sugar and spices, possibly clove and cinnamon, which are thought to sort of counterbalance the coldness and the moisture of the fruit. But the sugar is going to probably. So I'm a historian. I'm not despite my interests, I'm not a digestive gastroenterologist kind of expert. But I would imagine that eating too much fruit would give you some fairly serious digestive issues. And a lot of these people, again, I don't get into this, but a lot of these people are describing eating very large quantities of fruit. There's a Joan Drake, which is a printed account. She's described as eating, I think, 30 oranges in a sitting. So that would mess up anyone's stomach regardless. And then there's the question of whether the fruit is if it is spoiled in any way, or if it's being eaten underripe, which would cause kind of gastric issues. So I don't have a clear answer. I would imagine that part of it is also psychosomatic. If these people if they are genuinely experiencing despair to this degree, that's also going to affect how you digest, as it does with us today. So sorry if that's not a very satisfying answer, but
I find it very satisfactory. I think we have a little bit more time since we started a little bit late, so I just want to ask one more question to all the panelists, because I think one of the most interesting aspects of a theme about food and religion is it gets us into these really interesting questions of public and private, and how we want to think about that dichotomy. Both religion and food, I think, as you guys have shown, exist very easily in both of those sort of categories, which I understand are modern categories we're putting back on there. But I'm interested to hear with what you guys have been working on, sort of how you see food sort of functioning in the same way as religion as something that can transition between public and private, depending on where we see it and how it works.
Well, just to go back to the recipes to start with, again, I came to the recipe books with the assumption, the manuscript recipe books, that is, with the assumption that they were more personal. But so far, what it seems like is that recipe books were communal, not just within a family, but were often shared within the community, and women often borrowed and copied from each other's recipe books. And so, it's very interesting seeing this kind of knowledge transfer and how recipes get shared across place and time. But what that tells us is that these books aren't private, they're public, in the same way that letters are. So that's the first thing that comes to mind when you mention the relationship between private and public when it comes to the food sources we're looking at.
And just building off from that, from the first example that we looked at from the manuscript, from the recipe book that mentions aqua imperialis being connected to the great lords of the Saracens, you have to wonder who that note is for. Is it a note for themselves to remember that, or is it a note for as Elisa was saying, for the community, to remember that this is connected with the Saracens.
Go ahead, Eleanor.
Okay, so yeah, I think it is a mixture. I think in many ways it's very performative. So, you know, celebrating religious feasts, you don't do it alone, you do it with your community. It's a very kind of, yeah, public way of expressing your faith and your beliefs. Yeah, and what group you belong to. Sharing food around the table is all, yeah, more public than I think we kind of think of, you know, as our homes being very private. I think in this period they're more public than that. But I would just say it's interesting in this period for me looking at the changes of the Reformation, because especially in Protestant England, there's a new emphasis, or a renewed emphasis, I suppose, on the importance of personal piety and thinking and praying internally before you eat, you know, and thinking about the symbolism of the food and how that can connect you to God. So they're quite focused in their literature about these, what it does to you internally. And they're very clear that this is different from the Catholics, who have more performative gestures when they, you know, bless the food and so on. So I think it's both.
Michael?
Right. Yeah. So again, coming back to the Dionysus Fitzherbert, one of the interesting things there is that she is actually from a historically Catholic family whose name is associated with Catholicism. So she has a lot to prove, and this is a huge part of why she. I would imagine this is a huge part of why she writes her story, why she publicizes her story. It's circulated within sort of the community. So it's a very much a rhetorical text with a goal, and which is intended to be made public. Like it's not, even though it seems personal, it's in many ways not. Like Elisa was saying about the recipes. But I think the point that I would also make is that in the case of these types of conversion narratives, they're intended to be read and to produce a specific reaction. And in order to achieve that goal, they need to speak to something in people's emotions and people's affects that they're going to relate to. So in a sort of, I don't necessarily think that any of this stuff that Fitzherbert says necessarily happened, but like the fact that she tells it in this way still tells us something about the psychology and the experience of the people who are intended to consume, to read her. So consume, there you go, food in the book.
Thank you for using that word. That's the perfect word to end on for this conference. We are past 2 o'clock, so I'll bring things to a close now. First, I want to thank very much all the panelists. Thank you, Michael, Eleanor, Elisa, and Danielle. That was a wonderful panel that really got us into some really critical issues. So thank you all very much. The applause is coming from the audience out in the void. And thanks to all of you attendees for coming and joining us for this day's sessions. I hope all of you come back for our sessions tomorrow. We have two more sessions on literary ecologies and digitization and food history. And then of course there's our final public event on Monday for Indigenous Foodways Past and Present, which will also be live streamed on YouTube and Facebook if you can't make it into the Zoom webinar. Until then, thank you all very much. I hope you have a good day or evening, depending on where you are, and we look forward to seeing you again at the next session of Food in the Book. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.